Hi, welcome. Thanks for coming. It's super exciting to see a lot of you. Sorry there's a standing room only, but yeah, we're all comfy. We're all friends. My name is Eran Egozy. I am a professor of the practice here at MIT, and I teach music technology, which I'm excited about. And I see some of my students here. Hey, guys. But this is not about me. This is about Gustav Söderström, who is here from Spotify. Gustav is the Chief Research and Development Officer at Spotify, and he's been with the company for almost 10 years. I think 10 years this December. So in his role, he oversees all aspects of product development and engineering and design. Like he's got a lot of responsibilities under him. And overall product strategy, including new technology platforms, specifically in areas of AI and machine learning. A lot of stuff that we're very excited about here at MIT too. Gustav is also an entrepreneur. So prior to starting to work at Spotify, he was the co-founder and CEO of ConnectWorks, which was a company that basically created like a messaging platform back in that time of the early 2000s when that was big. They got bought by Yahoo right away, and so that worked out pretty well. And then he started working at Spotify, but then started another company while at Spotify, which is kind of nuts, but I like it. That company was called 13 Labs, and they created vision technology, and then they were bought by Oculus, which was bought by Facebook. So lots of cool entrepreneurship stuff going on, as well, of course, as being Chief R&D Officer of Spotify, which, as you might know, just earlier this year went public to great success. So a lot of great things going on here. I have a little personal story. When I was at Harmonix as CTO, I was talking to a friend of mine whose name is Tristan Jihan. Tristan was at the Media Lab, and it turns out Tristan and his friend Brian Whitman, also from the Media Lab, started a company. It was called the Echo Nest. And the Echo Nest, if you all might have heard of them, they essentially had the idea of doing a computational analysis of every single song out there on the internet. So they started doing this work. And at Harmonix, I was thinking, it would be great to work with these guys. So I started talking to Tristan. Could we make like some video games using this technology you made? And then I get this cryptic email one day saying like, actually, Eran, I can't talk to you about that anymore. I'm like, okay. And then I hear 3 weeks later that the Echo Nest was actually bought by Spotify. And Gustav was the one who arranged that. So that was cool, getting bought by Spotify. So we're totally psyched to have Gustav here with us today. He's visiting MIT today and tomorrow. There's actually a lot of great alignment between Gustav and Spotify and stuff we do at MIT. Spotify is very research focused, as is MIT, of course, in areas of AI and machine learning and cognition and linguistics, just to name a few. And also Gustav, since he's an entrepreneur, there's a lot of great entrepreneurship happening at MIT as well. You might have heard of the Sandbox Innovation Fund, which funds something like 300 companies a year. And of course, the Martin Trust Center for Entrepreneurship over at Sloan that sponsors a huge number of entrepreneurship programs. So lots of research, lots of startups. It's a great combination. And so I'm really excited to have Gustav up here to tell us about his startup story and what's been going on with Spotify for the past sort of 10 to 12 years, and also where they're going. So please join me in welcoming Gustav Söderström to the stage.
Thank you. Hey everyone, can you hear me okay? Thank you for having me. I'm very excited to be here. It's an honor to be at this fantastic institution. As you heard, my role at Spotify is to head up product, technology, data, and design. And that means all the applications and consumer experiences that you are using. But it also means the services and backends and the machine learning that powers it. Now, I've been with Spotify for almost 10 years. And I've had the chance to see it go from about maybe 30 people to to something like 3,000 people. A few 100,000 MAUs, monthly active users, to a few 100 million monthly active users. And from a few $100,000 in revenue to a few billion in revenue. Now, this has been a crazy journey, and one that I'm very fortunate to have been a part of. But as many of you are just about to embark on hopefully these kinds of journeys, I'd like to try to share a little bit of what it actually feels like, how exhilarating it can be, and how scary it can be. Now, I think that any good talk should make you feel like you learned some secrets when you leave it. Something that you thought you knew, but it turns out you didn't actually know. So I'm going to try to put a high bar here, and you'll be the judge at the end of this presentation, if you feel you learned some secrets or not. But to take you on this journey, I want to start by taking you back in time. I want to take you all the way back to 2008. You remember it? You were born then, right? Yeah. All right. So, you know, Timbaland and One Republic were on the charts with Apologize. Yeah, you all liked it. It's one of those guilty pleasures. I know, because I was on the inside, could see it. And 2008 was a pretty great year. I mean, the Large Hadron Collider was inaugurated at CERN in Geneva. Just look at this machine. Like a sci-fi author couldn't come up with this thing if they tried. It's just amazing. This guy happened as well. Just saying. Not taking any sides here. I'm a Swede. We didn't even take sides in World War II. And that was a pretty clear one, so. But more importantly, this happened, right? Spotify launched in Sweden. So this is where our journey starts. Now, I had just come back to Stockholm after having worked at Yahoo for a while, as was mentioned. And I was trying to figure out what to do with the rest of my life. And that's when I met this guy, Daniel Ek, the co-founder and CEO of Spotify. Now, he had this crazy idea that he wanted to take this. Anyone recognize it? Yeah, it's Napster, the original access model to music. All the world's music for free, with no advertising and offline sync. Think about that. A lot of people mistakenly think that Spotify brought the access model to music. We didn't. It already existed. So Daniel thought that this was actually a fantastic consumer proposition, just to have this flat access to music where you didn't have to pay a marginal cost to discover. But being a part-time musician himself, he wanted to do something that would actually also be good for creators, something that would be legal. So he wanted to take this, free access to all the music ever made, and he wanted to combine it with this. This is iTunes at the time. A much better user experience with great metadata, beautiful cover art, but more importantly, legal, where creators actually made money. So he showed me what he figured that this would look like. I instantly convinced. Really, this is actually the original design sketch of Spotify, done by a guy named Rasmus and Daniel. But in reality, they actually had a working beta of the product as well, that I got to try. And I was instantly blown away by this, and I joined the company. But the interesting question is exactly what was I blown away by? Well, any really good product usually pulls off some sort of magic trick. And this product pulled off a very distinct magic trick: speed. Now, back in 2008, streaming a file off of the internet could take several seconds to start. In fact, even playing a file from your own old spinning physical hard drive could take seconds to start. The Spotify team had come up with an end-to-end media distribution solution, both server and client side, not using any CDNs and being able to ignore all the standards, such as being able to hack the TCP protocol, things like Nagel's algorithm to optimize efficiency versus latency and so forth, and using custom peer-to-peer technology. The second thing that happened was that in Sweden, we had government-funded, high-bandwidth, low-latency internet that by this time had actually penetrated a pretty large part of the population. These two things together meant that when you clicked one of these tracks, it started playing in about 250 milliseconds, the perceptual limit of immediacy. I was just floored by this. I literally thought they had a huge hard drive in the closet behind this product when they demoed it to me. And the experience of this was the experience of having all of Napster downloaded to your hard drive. That was the magic trick. And that's why people switched to Spotify. Not because they didn't have access to music. They had that. And unfortunately, not because they cared at all about creators. It was the magic trick. So, in late 2008, I joined the company just as Spotify was launching. And it was an instant hit. By Christmas, it had gone from about 2,000 MAUs, monthly active users, to about 200,000. By March of 2009, it passed 1 million. And by September of that year, barely a year later, it was 3.2 million MAUs. Now, maybe that doesn't sound so much these days, but remember, most of this growth was in Sweden, a country of about 10 million people, including babies and the elderly. So we had penetrated something like half of the addressable market in no time. So Spotify on the desktop was a huge hit, and it was a success. But we saw that Spotify was only a really small part of people's music use case, of their music system. What people actually did was they used Spotify to search for music, to find it, to put it in playlists, and to share it with friends. And then when they had a great playlist, they still went to Napster, downloaded all the same files to iTunes to sync it to their iPod, because that is where they actually consume their music. The vast majority of music consumption has always been on the go, from Walkmans to Discmans to iPods to the car. So Spotify's vision was always to be your entire music system, not just a part of the music system. So when the iPhone launched in 2007, and then the App Store opened up in 2008, and the iPod, which was hardware at the time, followed Mark Andreessen's prediction of software eating the world and turned from a piece of hardware that you had in your pocket to a piece of software on your phone. Daniel figured that we could replace that piece of software with our piece of software, and then we could be your entire music system. So that's why he asked me to come on board, to try to figure out what Spotify's mobile proposition would be. And most people expected that Spotify Mobile would be a mobile version of Spotify Desktop, not an unreasonable expectation. But remember the magic trick. Now, when you were on a mobile phone in 2009, on 2G or Edge, and you try to stream something, it could take 10 seconds to start, then it would stutter, and then you would get this SMS from an operator saying, you're out of data, right? There was nothing magical about that experience at all. So we realized that Spotify Mobile would at most be this fun thing that you could use when you happen to be on really good Wi-Fi. But we didn't want to be a fun thing in companion with your iPod. We wanted to replace your iPod. So actually, the requirements for Spotify Mobile were pretty straightforward. Spotify Mobile had to work wherever your iPod worked. Now, your iPod would work in the subway, when you were abroad with roaming charges, and when you were on a flight. So Spotify Mobile simply had to work offline. So we traveled to London, we met with the labels, and we asked them for a license which would allow us to store 10,000 tracks offline on your phone for up to a month before you had to reconnect and verify that you were still a paying customer. There were lots of negotiations, there were white papers on encryption sent back and forth, but eventually they agreed at a price of $9.99 per month. So now we had our license, and we built the product for iOS and Android. This was a truly seamless music experience. As soon as you added a track to your playlist on desktop, it would immediately and silently start synchronizing to your phone, so that when you later wanted to play that song, it was already there. So it was a great experience. But when we asked users, basically the question, how do you feel about starting to pay $120 per year for something that you already have for free? Guess what? None of them said they would. I mean, zero. Because they figured the system they had worked just fine. Fortunately for us, we weren't good enough at user research, so we launched it anyway. See what happens. The initial reactions were lukewarm at best, ranging from good luck to no freaking way I'm going to pay for this thing. But then something really interesting happened. We saw it in the data. People started walking out the door, realizing that they had forgot to manually synchronize one of their songs from Spotify to their Napster plus iTunes playlist. And they said, like, oh, this is really inconvenient. Maybe $9.99 isn't that much. It's only the price of 2 beers. Actually, 1 beer in Sweden. And they started converting. First in single-digit percentages, then in double-digit percentages. And it outperformed any freemium model we had ever seen. I mean, the bar at the time was Skype. And Skype was, I think, converting at something like 7%. We went from 7%, past 10%, past 20%, past 30%. And we had stumbled on this incredible freemium model, where, as a product, we didn't only reach the people who already wanted to pay $9.99 for music, which was a very small group at the time in Sweden, because piracy was rampant and legal. But we had this proprietary engine, our free product, that basically created these users out of thin air. We just sat and watched these non-music lovers kind of become music lovers and start paying eventually. So now we had not only a great product, we actually had a business. And our premium conversion curve started trending sharply upwards. Going into 2010, things were great. We were growing at a great clip, both in free and paid users. And the future looked pretty bright. In June of 2010, Daniel decided to have a lead team offsite in this gazebo in the Swedish archipelago. It's a very nice gazebo. You know, people were excited, things were looking good. But I had just read through Mary Meeker's, a famous analyst at the time, her classic State of the Internet 2010 presentation. And as we sat down and looked at this slide, we realized that the party was going to end. Now, the orange and blue bar here are desktop and laptop computers. The green bar is smartphones. Now, for the desktop and laptops, we had our free tier that performed this magic trick that eventually made people want to pay for the smartphone, right? But if Mary Meeker was right, in 2012, we would start seeing users that were mobile only, or at least mobile first. They never had a desktop. We had no free tier for them. We had no magic trick. So we realized that our entire business model was doomed. But you couldn't see it in the data yet. And while we were, it was this weird feeling of kind of panicking in slow motion. Imagine someone coming up to you and screaming like, oh my God, you're gonna die. And you're like, when? And they're like, oh no, 5 years from now. What do you do with that? It's hard. So we started thinking about this tricky problem, like how do we give away the thing that is driving all of our revenue for free? Mobility, that's what we were charging for mobility. So while we were panicking about the desktop free tier disappearing, no one else saw it yet. In fact, the labels thought the desktop free tier was too good. And they came up with this bright idea that if we only made it much worse, people would convert. That's product development for you. This was probably as a product person, this is probably the low point of my life. I mean, someone asked me to deliberately make my product as bad as possible as a strategy. It didn't matter how much data we showed them, that the only correlation between free and paid users was how much they engaged in the free tier, which is not an unreasonable hypothesis. Like, you're going to pay for a product that you use, right? And the more you use it, the more valuable you're probably going to think it is. And at some point, that value is going to cross $9.99. You're going to become a premium user. Not unreasonable. All the data supported it. Didn't bite. So the labels force us to introduce caps on the free desktop product. So you could only listen for a few hours per week, and then the entire product stopped working. Even worse than that, you could only play a certain track a certain amount of times, and then it grayed out forever. Yeah, that really happened. We were actively kicking out our most engaged users of the product. So the test went live, and as predicted, there was an insignificant one-time bump in premium conversion, but no change to the slope of the curve. And then user growth started tanking. Now, it wasn't just flat. We were actually losing users. And as you may learn in life, very few people, very few companies get to stare negative growth in the face and live to talk about it. It's very rare. Now, we managed to later reverse these caps with the labels and end what might have been the dumbest A/B test of the century. An A/B test without a B group, by the way. But it didn't matter. Our product was tainted, our brand was hurt, and consumers were really confused about what Spotify was. And we kept declining. In spite of this, in July of this year, we decided to launch in the US. Now, in the US, people hadn't heard of this capped product, so we weren't suffering from the same user confusion. So we started growing a little bit. Now, on the other hand, people in the US hadn't heard of Spotify at all, so we didn't grow very fast. And we didn't know if this was actually a new beginning or just the last twitch of a dying corpse. In September of that year, we launched a partnership with Facebook, where we try to make it as easy as possible to find, share, and listen to music with your friends. It was kind of our Hail Mary. Fortunately for us, it worked, and the US discovered Spotify. We had escaped the jaws of death for the first time. So we were back to healthy growth, and from the outside, if you were an investor, things looked pretty good. But we all had this ominous Mary Meeker slide in the back of our minds, of our impending doom. And when we looked at the data in 2012, she sure seemed to be right. Smartphones were exploding, while desktop was slowing down rapidly. And in June of 2013, the shift to mobile finally showed up in our metrics. And we were facing negative growth for the second time. It was a summer vacation in Europe, and our desktop usage always dipped during summer vacation because people left their clunky laptops and desktops at home when they were traveling and used their phone instead. But we had always seen desktop usage come back with a vengeance in July and August. But this year, it was as if they had put their computers in the closet when they went on vacation, and they simply never took it out again. This was the summer that Europe went mobile, and it really happened all at once. So now we really needed a mobile free tier. But our challenge was that it wasn't just enough to come up with what a mobile free tier would look like that wouldn't cannibalize our premium users. We also needed to convince the labels to license it to us. And they had no intention of doing this as long as we were growing. So it literally required negative growth to get them to the table. Now, during the last few years, we had been experimenting with different hypotheses for a mobile free tier. For example, what if Spotify Mobile was free on Wi-Fi but paid on cellular? And a bunch of other hypotheses. But we had settled on an insight from a person in my team named Charlie Hellman. who had looked at all the premium user data and realized that most of the premium users, almost all of them, they actually shuffle play their playlist about 50% of the time, voluntarily. Even though they could play them on demand and in order, they chose to shuffle play them. So we started thinking, this seemed like a pretty good use case to be able to shuffle play your playlists. So what if we would give away that use case for free? That meant that we had a great product for free users. But it also wasn't the entire use case for any premium user, right? It was at most 50%. So the thinking was, could we have our cake and eat it? Could we give away one use case, but not so much that the premium users would actually go back to free? So during the fall, we were working on this product that we call Spotify Mobile Free. The idea was that it would be the only product in the App Store where you as a user could go in, create a playlist, and listen to your own playlist for free. There was really no competition for that in the App Store. The only thing that existed was here in the US, which was Pandora with their stations. So what we did was we took all the user data, we reverse engineered and asked to labels for a shuffle license where we asked for exactly the artist and track diversity we needed for 99.9% of user playlists to be able to shuffle without us having to insert any artificial tracks. So we used the data to look at exactly what kind of artist diversity we needed. So during the fall, we were working like crazy to get this product ready while the licensing team was trying to get it licensed. And in late 2013, we got the licenses signed, and we put the application up in the App Store the very same day. And then we held our breath. Was the hypothesis right? Would we actually save the company again? As soon as we hit the App Store, we started growing like crazy. And we grew, and we grew, and then it stopped. And it was Christmas. What are you going to do? You can't move Christmas. And we knew that there was always lower engagement during Christmas, like there was during summer. But it was really hard to know if this was a big one-time bump of pent-up demand, and we were out of growth again, and we didn't have a company. Or if we were genius, we were just standing on this rocket that had temporarily stopped to refuel. So none of us relaxed very much this Christmas. When we came back in January, it turned out that we were on a rocket. And we started growing and growing. During 2014, we just tried to hold on to our hats and make sure we didn't screw it up. And by September 2014, we were 51 million MAUs. And by February, we had reached 63 million MAUs. So we had escaped the jaws of death for a second time. We now had a much more healthy and stable business model that actually worked. So kind of for the first time in our history, we got the chance to think about something else than how not to die. We actually started thinking about how we could make Spotify better for consumers. So Spotify was a really great experience if you were a music aficionado. We gave you this really powerful search box and a music programming language called playlists. And if you knew your back catalog and you kept up to date with all the new releases, you could soundtrack your life perfectly. But the problem was that everyone isn't that good at music. And we wanted Spotify to be for everyone. So in 2015, we saw this company called Tunigo in Sweden, who was using Spotify Playlist as a platform. Now, they were playlisting along completely new dimensions. Things like workout, party, focus, dinner with friends. And these use cases seemed to really resonate with users who kind of knew what they wanted to do, and they sort of knew what it should sound like, but they couldn't translate it into musical terms. I mean, is workout hip-hop, trip-hop, big room, or house? It's not that easy to figure out. Now, on the outside, Tunigo could really only see how many subscribers they had to these playlists. But from the inside, we could see the engagement. We could see the streams and how many people were coming back. And it was high. So we decided to acquire them in a bet where we would give them access to all the data on the inside and try to build the most data-driven playlisting system in history. Once on the inside, these editors, who by the way was this incredibly powerful team that was super diverse of musical experts representing all kinds of different genres, they could take a playlist like songs to sing in the car, for example, and they could drop in a track, and within minutes, they could see plays completions, skips, saves. They could remove, add, and re-rank in this inexorable loop that simply optimized the playlist for the use case. So this made Spotify much more accessible for mainstream type of listening. Now, while more mainstream listeners lauded these playlists and engagement was super high, the music aficionados, which turns out is a large part of the journalistic core, they hated it. They said that it was hopelessly mainstream, which was, of course, the whole point, and a compliment to the team. It turned out, though, that the music aficionados, they seemed to really like our recommendations. Now, we had been lucky, and already all the way from the start, we had some people like Erik Bernhardsson who actually understood machine learning, back in 2008, which is pretty early. And we saw that these recommendations, like similar artists, for example, they really resonated with the more advanced users, and it gave them a great way to traverse the catalog. Now, the reason that we could have such good recommendations for rather obscure and narrow tastes was because we had, by luck, built a huge data advantage in our playlists. Now, it turns out that when users are playlisting and soundtracking their lives along different dimensions for their own benefit, they're also essentially labeling the tracks for the rest of the system, for all the rest of the audience. Now, this is me, not only grouping tracks that go well together, but then classifying them as anthems. And today, we have over 3 billion of these classifications of the world's music catalog. And this means that we can serve even very narrow tastes. Now, as I said, this was more luck by design, but you have to get lucky. There is this concept in machine learning called turning the dial that Ajay Agrawal uses in his new book, Prediction Machines. Essentially, it means that when you turn up the dial of accuracy on your predictions or your recommendations, when you start, your product or your business is going to improve linearly, right? But at some level, your entire product and maybe business model can switch. Now, I didn't think about it as this concept back then because the book is rather new. But exactly this happened to me back in 2014 when I started using a product that was then actually not called Google Photos. It was called Google Plus Photos. They applied exactly this concept, right? So while Apple was trying to solve the consumer problem of your iPhone producing way too many photos for you to organize, by giving you an even better tool to manually organize them in iPhotos, Google took the completely different approach. Using machine learning with prediction accuracy or recommendation accuracy that was high enough, they actually said, you will never organize your photos again. Now, this stuck in the back of our minds. And we started thinking, what if we could do something similar? What if we could be so bold that instead of just using our recommendations to give you even better tools like similar artists and search to playlist yourself, we could say, actually, you're never going to play this again. So, with this in the back of our minds, in 2014, we acquired the eminent company, The Economist, out of Boston, MIT. Now, these people were by far the best at audio recommendations in the business. It was a fantastic set of entrepreneurs. And they actually powered the recommendations of all of our competitors. But none of them, or us, actually wanted to give them all the user data. So they had to work on audio signals and externally publicly available data. So we were thinking to ourselves, what if we could take all of this talent and combine it with what was already then the biggest amount of music listening data in the world? Could we create something magical? So we acquired them, and about a year later, actually, pretty quickly, this team figured out what this missing consumer proposition was, how we could turn this thing on its head. When we launched Discover Weekly, this is a musical assistant that uses your taste and tirelessly scours through the back catalog of tens of millions of tracks to figure out if you might have missed a gem, and then presents it to you as a weekly playlist. For the mainstream users, the back catalog wasn't that big of a problem. You could actually mostly look at the charts if you wanted to understand what was interesting in the 90s. But for the music aficionados, this was a godsend. And for many of them, it outperformed what they had been able to do with the help of search and with the help of their music friends. This was our first self-driving playlist. And since then, we've created several more, such as Time Capsule, Release Radar, Daily Mix, and so forth. By May 2016, we passed 100 million MAUs. There's Christmas, by the way. This time we didn't get us scared. We recognize that. And in 2017, something new and interesting started happening. Speakers. Now, all the way back in 2013, we realized that if you went through all the trouble back then of hooking up your streaming solution to a connected speaker system like Sonos, which was very expensive and exclusive at the time, it was a great experience. And we had this realization that, well, pretty much everyone had a CD player in their home that they used to listen to a lot in the days of CD. Pretty much no one ever managed to hook up their files, their Napster and iTunes files, to their stereo, right? It was just too complicated to do. But when streaming happened, it got super simple again. You bought the speaker and it had all the world's music built in. So we made a huge bet that people would start converting to connected speakers sooner or later. And so what we did was we started creating a media streaming protocol. Now, like I said, this was in 2013, long before Cast or anything like that. The only thing that existed was Apple AirPlay, which streamed like from your phone to your speakers. If you went too far away, it started stuttering. We wanted to build this media streaming protocol that was cloud-centric and user-centric, right? So all you sent was some metadata, and the speaker started streaming from the cloud. So you could get this really magical experience of listening on your headphones. You went up to a speaker and you press play, and the stream would just continue from where you were in your headphones over there, right? Because all the devices were aware of what your account was playing right now. And this was a big bet. We started building software SDKs for all kinds of embedded systems and chips. And after something like 4 years, we had gotten pretty much the entire speaker industry to adopt this protocol. We're actually running code inside of all this hardware, except Apple, of course. So while we didn't predict voice being the thing that would unlock this upgrade of the home to the connected speaker, we were right enough in our prediction that when this macro wind started blowing, we were really well positioned to follow it. This brings us to 2018, which was a huge year for Spotify. This is the year when we went public. Yes. Now, usually, when you do an IPO, which stands for Initial Public Offering, you actually want to raise money, right? So what you do is you do this roadshow where you go and meet big investors and you pre-negotiate a price for your stock, which is usually at a hefty discount of what it's supposed to go public at, so that there's this pop, as it's called, when it goes public. But Spotify didn't need to raise any money. We had plenty of cash. The other problem, we actually had to go public for regulatory reasons. We're getting too big. The other problem with the IPO is that because of lots of arcane rules which were originally aimed at protecting consumers, employees ended up being locked up for months and couldn't participate in the potential upside. So that was left only for investors and maybe some senior management. And that seemed very unfair. So our CFO, Barry McCarthy, he decided that he wanted to innovate on this process as well. And he found this other way of going public, which is called direct listing, which no one does. It's actually only used by companies that have gone bankrupt and want to relist. And the interesting thing is there are very different rules and regulations for how that kind of listing happens. Instead of pre-deciding the price over months of negotiation with investors, the price is actually set on the morning of the listing through true price discovery of supply and demand. And the second thing is there are no lockups for employees. So we decided to do this. Now, I remember sitting and listening on a conference phone to the floor of the New York Stock Exchange with people actually screaming prices and quotes. Now, you don't do that anymore usually. Like I said, it's all pre-decided, it's all computers. But in this process, what happens is, before the stock goes public, you have a bunch of people who want to sell, and you have a bunch of people who want to buy. And you manually broker these deals, and they can ask whatever price they want. Now, hopefully, the price interval starts to narrow, and then it gets in some range where that is the price of the stock, and it just floats and goes public. Now, no one actually knew if there was enough supply and demand for this to work, or if it would be super volatile or go all over the place. And the price discovery ended up taking hours. And I remember a broker, we'll leave him unnamed, who thought it was on mute, screaming like, "Jesus Christ, we'll never get this effing stock public." But it turned out to be all right. Eventually, the stock went public, and we were a public company. And it was back to work. Now, this brings us to today, closing in on about 200 million users. And the thing that we realized looking at this curve was that no single thing we ever did actually turned out to have exponential growth. It all had linear effects, right? But the point is that the sum of many linear curves, of many linear effects, turns out to be exponential, right? So the job is to constantly apply linear improvements to your business, and you will get exponential growth. So with that, I'm hoping that you feel like you learned some secrets and have a sense of what it might be like to be on one of these rides.